The wind howled through the broken window frame of the farmhouse just outside Hays City, Kansas, carrying dust and the scent of failure with it. But Katherine Greene refused to let her 3 children see the tears that threatened to fall as she stared at the empty flour barrel in the corner. The year was 1873, and the drought had taken everything from her except the 4 beating hearts under this roof, including her own, and she had buried her husband Samuel 6 months ago after a wagon accident on the main road into town. Her eldest, Daniel, was only 8 years old, followed by 5-year-old Margaret and 3-year-old Thomas, all of them looking at her with eyes that held more trust than she felt she deserved given their circumstances. She had sold nearly everything of value over the past months, watching their possessions disappear one by one like water through her fingers, but the money never stretched far enough. The farm had yielded almost nothing this season, the earth cracked and stubborn, refusing to give life to the seeds she had planted with prayers on her lips. Katherine had tried taking in washing from the townspeople, but even that work had dried up, as the drought made everyone careful with their water and their coins. The children had grown thinner, their clothes more patched than original fabric now, but they never complained, and that somehow made it worse. "Mama, I am hungry," Thomas said softly from where he sat on the floor playing with a carved wooden horse Samuel had made for him before the accident. Katherine knelt beside him and brushed the sandy blonde hair from his forehead, forcing brightness into her voice that she did not feel. "I know, sweetheart. We will have supper soon. Why do not you and Margaret go gather some of those prairie flowers we saw yesterday? They would look lovely on the table." The children scrambled up with the resilience only the young possessed, and she watched them head out into the fading afternoon light while Daniel remained behind, his young face too serious for his years. He had become the man of the house in his own mind after his father died, and Katherine saw him studying their situation with an awareness that broke her heart. "We do not have much food left, do we?" he asked directly. She would not lie to him. "No, we do not, but I will figure something out." "I always do." He nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 pennies. "I found these near the old fence post. Maybe it will help." Katherine pulled him close and held him tight, feeling the sob that wanted to escape lodge in her throat. This boy, barely more than a baby himself, trying to save them with 3 pennies he had probably been saving for something special. She kissed the top of his head and accepted the coins with all the gratitude she would have shown for a chest of gold. That evening, she made a thin soup from the last of their vegetables and a handful of beans, stretching it with water until it barely qualified as food. The children ate without complaint, and afterward she tucked them into the bed they all shared in the single bedroom, telling them stories of better times until their eyes grew heavy. She sat by candlelight long into the night, staring at the few coins they had left and trying to calculate impossible mathematics, where any sum would equal enough. Morning came too quickly, painted in shades of gold and dust across the Kansas prairie. Katherine rose before the children and stood on the sagging porch, surveying the land that should have been their livelihood, but had become their prison instead. She was trying to decide whether to walk into town and beg for credit at the general store, when she noticed a figure on horseback approaching from the east, moving at an easy pace that suggested someone comfortable in the saddle and in no particular hurry. As the rider drew closer, she could make out details. A tall man wearing a weather-beaten hat, dusty clothes that had seen hard use, and a horse that looked well cared for despite the rough conditions of the trail. He sat straight in the saddle with the natural grace of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. When he reached the property line, He slowed and seemed to be studying the farmhouse and outbuildings with interest, and Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with something else she could not quite name. The rider approached and removed his hat as he neared, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind but still handsome in a rugged way. His eyes were a striking shade of blue-green that reminded her of the river in spring before the drought had diminished it to a trickle. He appeared to be somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, with the lean strength of a working man. "Morning, madam," he said, his voice deep and warm with a slight drawl that spoke of time spent further south. "I hope I am not intruding. I saw your property from the road and wondered if you might be in need of help with repairs or such." Katherine crossed her arms, unsure whether to be hopeful or suspicious. "I am afraid I cannot afford to hire anyone for repairs, sir. We are managing well enough on our own." It was a transparent lie given the state of the property, and they both knew it. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. The fence had gaps wide enough for livestock to escape if they had any livestock left, and the porch where she stood sagged dangerously on one corner. The man did not call her out on the falsehood, though, and she appreciated that small mercy. "Name is Isaac Fletcher," he said, dismounting with fluid ease. "I am not looking for money, madam. I have been on the trail for a while and could use a few days of honest work to settle my mind. I would be grateful for some food and a place to sleep in the barn, and I could fix up some of these things that need attention. Seems like a fair trade to me." She studied him carefully, searching for signs of dishonesty or ill intent, but found only a straightforward sincerity in his gaze. "Why would you work for just food? Surely you could find paying work in town." Isaac shrugged and looked out over the prairie for a moment before answering. "Sometimes a man needs to feel useful more than he needs coins in his pocket. I have enough to get by, and the work is what matters. Besides, I can see you have children, and I respect a mother trying to keep her family together." Katherine felt something shift in her chest at his words. She wanted to refuse out of pride, to insist they did not need charity, but pride would not feed her children or keep the roof from caving in come winter. She thought of Daniel's 3 pennies and made her decision. "Katherine Greene," she said, uncrossing her arms. "I have 3 children, and I will not have them exposed to anyone dangerous or improper. If I agree to this arrangement, I expect respectful behavior and honest work. You have my word on both counts, Mrs. Greene," Isaac said, and she noticed he had correctly assumed she was a widow by the lack of a husband's presence and the black mourning dress she still wore. "It is just Katherine. And I suppose if you are serious about the offer, you should start with the barn door before one of the children gets hurt on it." Isaac smiled then, a genuine expression that lit up his whole face and made him look younger. "Yes, madam, I will get right on that. Just point me toward your tools and I will begin." She showed him to the small shed where Samuel's tools hung on the wall, most of them unused since the accident because she lacked the knowledge, and the children lacked the strength to manage them properly. Isaac examined each one with care, testing edges and handles, making small approving sounds that suggested he found them adequate for the task at hand. Katherine left him to his work and went back inside to tend to the children, who were waking and asking questions about the stranger in their yard. Over the course of that first day, Isaac proved himself to be a man of his word. He repaired the barn door, mended 3 sections of fence, and even fixed the porch supports so that the entire structure sat level for the first time in months. He worked steadily through the heat of the day, pausing only to water his horse and drink from the pump in the yard. Katherine found herself watching him from the window more often than she cared to admit, noting the competent way he handled tools and the care he took with even the smallest repair. When evening came, she called him in for supper with a mixture of embarrassment over their meager fare and gratitude for his labor. The children stared at him with wide eyes as he washed up at the pump and came inside, ducking slightly through the doorway to accommodate his height. He removed his hat and stood awkwardly until Katherine gestured for him to sit at the table, which suddenly seemed small and intimate with a man filling the space where Samuel used to sit. "Children, this is Mr. Fletcher," she said. "He has been helping with repairs today. Can you say hello?" Daniel extended his hand seriously, and Isaac shook it with equal gravity. "Thank you for helping my mama," the boy said. Margaret hid behind Katherine's skirts but peeked out with curious eyes, while Thomas simply stared with his wooden horse clutched in one small fist. Isaac greeted each of them with warmth, but did not push for more interaction than they were willing to give, which Katherine noted with approval. She served the thin stew she had managed to create from the supplies he had brought in his saddlebag, contributions he had made without fanfare or expectation of thanks, and the family ate together in a silence that was less awkward than she had feared. "This is fine cooking," Isaac said after his first bite, though they both knew the food was plain and barely sufficient. Katherine felt her cheeks warm at the compliment even though she knew it was generous. "You are kind to say so. I am afraid our supplies are limited with the drought and all." "The drought has been hard on everyone," Isaac agreed, "but it will break eventually. It always does." "And if it does not break before winter?" she asked, the worry slipping out before she could stop it. Isaac met her eyes across the table with a steadiness that felt like an anchor in stormy seas. "Then we will figure something out. One day at a time is all we can manage." That word "we" hung in the air between them, presumptuous and comforting in equal measure. Katherine did not correct him, though she was not sure why. Perhaps because it had been so long since she had anyone to share the burden with, or perhaps because something about Isaac Fletcher made her want to believe that solutions were possible. The days turned into a week, and Isaac remained true to his word. He worked on different projects each day, moving from urgent repairs to improvements that made life easier for Katherine and the children. He fixed the pump so it ran more smoothly, repaired the chicken coop that had been empty since they sold the last hen, and even crafted a new rope swing for the children that hung from the sturdy oak tree near the house. The children warmed to him gradually, with Thomas being the first to fully accept his presence, following him around like a small shadow and chattering about everything and nothing. Katherine found herself warming to him as well, though she fought against it out of loyalty to Samuel's memory and fear of being hurt again. Isaac made it difficult to maintain her emotional distance, though. He had a quiet humor that emerged at unexpected moments, making her laugh when she had forgotten that such things were possible. He spoke to her as an equal rather than a helpless widow, asking her opinion on how things should be done and listening carefully to her answers. He played with the children in the evenings after work, teaching Daniel how to whittle and telling Margaret stories that made her giggle. At night, he slept in the barn as agreed, never presuming or pushing for more than she was willing to give. Katherine lay awake in her own bed and tried not to think about the man sleeping under her roof, tried not to compare his quiet strength to Samuel's often boisterous energy. She felt guilty for even noticing Isaac as a man rather than simply a helpful stranger. But grief and loneliness made strange companions in the dark hours. It was on the 8th day that everything changed. Katherine had gone into town to trade some mending work for supplies, leaving Isaac to watch the children. She had been gone for perhaps 3 hours when she returned to find Daniel running toward her down the road, his face streaked with tears and his breath coming in gasps. "Mama," Mama. Thomas fell and he will not wake up. Her heart stopped in her chest as she dropped the small sack of flour she had bartered for and ran toward the house with Daniel. She found Isaac on the porch holding Thomas, who was pale and motionless in his arms. Margaret sat nearby, crying into her hands. "What happened?" Katherine demanded, reaching for her son with shaking hands. "He climbed on the fence and fell," Isaac explained quickly, his voice tight with concern. "He hit his head on a rock. He woke up for a moment but then lost consciousness again. We need to get him to a doctor immediately." Katherine nodded, unable to form words past the terror that squeezed her throat. Isaac was already moving toward his horse, still carrying Thomas with careful arms. He mounted with the boy cradled against his chest and then reached down for Katherine. "Come on. We need to ride fast." She hesitated only a second before taking his hand and letting him pull her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed close to Thomas, whispering prayers and promises to her unconscious child, as Isaac urged his horse into a gallop toward Hayes City. The 5-mile ride passed in a blur of fear and dust, with Katherine holding tight to both Isaac and her son, feeling the steady thunder of the horses' hooves matching the frantic beating of her heart. They reached the doctor's office on Main Street in record time, and Isaac dismounted in one smooth motion before helping Katherine down and handing her Thomas. The doctor, an older man named Brennan who had practiced in Hayes City since it was founded 6 years earlier, took one look at the situation and ushered them inside immediately. He examined Thomas while Katherine stood nearby wringing her hands, and Isaac waited quietly in the corner, his hat in his hands and his face etched with worry. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Dr. Brennan straightened up with a cautiously optimistic expression. "The boy has a concussion, but I believe he will be fine with rest. Children are remarkably resilient. He needs to stay awake for the next several hours and be monitored closely for any changes. If he starts vomiting or has trouble speaking, bring him back immediately." Katherine sagged with relief so profound it made her dizzy, and she felt Isaac's hand on her elbow, steadying her. She looked up at him and saw her own relief mirrored in his eyes, saw something deeper there too that made her breath catch. This man who had been a stranger just over a week ago cared about her son, cared about her family, and the realization hit her like a physical force. "Thank you," she whispered. "If you had not been there, if you had not gotten him here so quickly." "But I was there," Isaac said firmly. "And he is going to be fine. That is all that matters." Thomas stirred on the examination table and opened his eyes, looking confused and frightened until he saw his mother. Katherine gathered him carefully into her arms and held him while he cried, soothing him with soft words and gentle touches. Isaac paid the doctor before Katherine could even think to worry about the cost, waving away her protests with a quiet insistence that made further argument impossible. They returned to the farm more slowly, with Thomas wrapped in Katherine's arms and supported by Isaac's careful driving of a borrowed wagon the doctor insisted they take. Daniel and Margaret had been watched by a neighbor woman Isaac had fetched before riding to town, and they ran out to meet them when the wagon pulled up to the house. The family reunited with hugs and tears, and profound gratitude that things had not been worse. That evening, after Thomas was settled and sleeping peacefully under close observation, Katherine found Isaac on the porch staring out at the sunset, painting the prairie in shades of orange and purple. She sat beside him, leaving a respectable distance between them but feeling the connection nonetheless. "I can never repay you for what you did today," she said quietly. Isaac shook his head. "There is no debt to repay. I did what anyone would do." "No," Katherine corrected. "You did what a good man would do. There is a difference." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the prairie settling into evening, crickets beginning their chorus, the whisper of wind through dry grass, the distant call of a bird heading home. Katherine felt something inside her shift and settle, like a bone that had been out of place finally clicking back where it belonged. "Why did you really stop here, Isaac?" she asked, using his given name for the first time. "Please tell me the truth." He was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. "I saw you standing on the porch that first morning, and I saw the way you held yourself, proud and strong despite everything working against you. I saw the love you have for your children in every line of your face, and I thought that was someone worth knowing, worth helping if I could. I have been drifting for a long time since I lost my own family in a fire down in Texas 3 years ago. I guess I was looking for a reason to stop drifting." Katherine's heart ached for the pain in his words. "I am sorry for your loss, and I am sorry for yours," he replied, glancing at her mourning dress. "But grief does not have to last forever. Life keeps moving forward whether we are ready or not." She knew he was right, had known it for months but had been unable to act on the knowledge. Samuel was a good man. He deserves to be remembered. "Of course he does," Isaac agreed. "And he is every day in those beautiful children he gave you. But remembering him does not mean you have to stop living yourself." Katherine felt tears slip down her cheeks and did not bother to wipe them away. "I am frightened," she admitted. "Of being alone, of failing my children, of feeling anything for someone else. It all terrifies me." Isaac reached over and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. "You are not alone anymore, Katherine. Not unless you want to be. I am here, and I would like to stay if you will have me. Not just for a few days, but for as long as you will let me. I have grown to care deeply for you and your children, and I believe I could make a good life here if you would give me the chance." Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You barely know us." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you are strong and loving and brave. I know your children are good-hearted and bright. I know that when I think about riding away from here, something in my chest feels like it is being torn apart. Sometimes you just know when you have found where you belong." Katherine turned to look at him fully, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the hope mixed with fear that mirrored her own feelings. She thought about Daniel's 3 pennies, about Thomas falling and Isaac catching him, about all the small kindnesses and large sacrifices he had made without being asked. She thought about the way her children had begun to smile again, and the way her own heart had started to thaw after months of frozen grief. "I cannot promise I am ready for everything that might mean," she said carefully. "My heart is still healing." "Then I will wait," Isaac said. "However long it takes. I am a patient man, and you are worth waiting for." Something in Katherine's chest loosened at his words like chains falling away. She squeezed his hand and allowed herself to smile, really smile, for the first time since Samuel's death. "Then stay. Please stay." The relief and joy that flooded Isaac's face was beautiful to witness. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it made her heart flutter. "I will spend every day proving you made the right choice." The following weeks brought a transformation to the Greene farm that seemed almost miraculous. With Isaac's help, they planted a late-season vegetable garden in a low spot where water might collect better, using techniques he had learned during his years of traveling. He rode into Hays City and returned with a milk cow he had traded some work for, giving the children fresh milk for the first time in months. He repaired the irrigation system Samuel had started but never finished, coaxing water from the creek to nourish their struggling crops. More than the physical improvements, though, was the change in the family spirit. The children blossomed under Isaac's attention, their laughter returning to fill the house with life. Daniel followed him everywhere, soaking up knowledge about farming and ranching and what it meant to be a man. Margaret came out of her shell and took to sitting on Isaac's lap in the evenings, demanding stories and songs in equal measure. Thomas recovered fully from his fall and declared that Isaac was his best friend in the whole world. Katherine watched it all with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She could feel herself falling in love with Isaac Fletcher, feel the walls around her heart crumbling a little more each day. The way he looked at her made her feel like a woman again, rather than just a mother and a widow. The accidental touches when they worked side by side sent sparks through her body that she had thought dead and buried. The sound of his voice as he sang the children to sleep made her long for things she had no right to want so soon after Samuel's death. But Isaac never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He courted her with patience and gentleness, bringing her wildflowers from the prairie, complimenting her cooking even when it was plain, asking about her dreams and actually listening to the answers. He told her stories of his travels and his life before the fire, sharing his grief and his hopes with an openness that made her brave enough to share her own. One evening in late September, after the children were asleep, and the first hints of autumn had begun to cool the oppressive heat, Katherine found Isaac repairing harness leather by lamplight in the barn. She had made an excuse about checking on the cow, but they both knew why she was really there. The air between them had been charged for days now, building towards something inevitable. "You do not have to hide in the barn anymore," she said softly from the doorway. "There is a spare room in the house. It was Samuel's office, but we could move things around." Isaac set down the leather and stood slowly, his eyes searching her face. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured." "I am not," Katherine assured him, stepping into the barn and closing the door behind her for privacy. "I am sure about a lot of things lately. I am sure that you are a good man. I am sure that my children love you. I am sure that I—" She trailed off, the words caught in her throat despite her certainty about the feelings behind them. Isaac crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and cupped her face in his hands with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. "You do not have to say it yet if you are not ready," he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I can wait." "I am tired of waiting," Katherine whispered. "I am tired of being afraid. Samuel would not want me to stop living, and I do not think I can keep pretending that I do not feel what I feel." "And what do you feel?" Isaac asked, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine reached up and covered his hands with her own, holding them against her face. "I feel like I am waking up after a long sleep. I feel like the sun is shining again after months of darkness. I feel like I could love you, Isaac Fletcher, if I let myself. I think maybe I already do." The kiss that followed was gentle and sweet, a question and an answer all at once. Katherine felt herself melt into his embrace, felt the rightness of being held by this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had not known how to voice. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and smiling. "Marry me," Isaac said suddenly. "I know it is fast, but I am certain about this about us. Let me be a father to your children and a husband to you. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you and they have everything you need." Katherine laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside that had been silent for too long. "People will talk. It has barely been 6 months since Samuel died." "Let them talk," Isaac said fiercely. "What matters is that we are happy and your children are cared for. Anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me." She pretended to consider, drawing out the moment just to see the nervous hope in his eyes. "Well, when you put it that way, how can I refuse? Yes, Isaac. Yes, I will marry you." He picked her up and spun her around. both of them laughing like children, and Katherine felt the last pieces of her broken heart click back into place. When he set her down, she was dizzy with happiness and hope and the promise of new beginnings. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Hays City, with Daniel standing proudly as the best man and Margaret as the flower girl. Thomas held Katherine's bouquet of prairie flowers with intense concentration, determined not to drop a single petal. The townspeople who had witnessed Katherine's struggles filled the pews, offering their support despite any gossip about the speed of the courtship. The minister, who had buried Samuel and knew the family's circumstances well, blessed the union with genuine warmth. Katherine wore her best dress, freshly cleaned and pressed, though it was not white. Isaac wore new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion, looking handsome and nervous as he waited at the altar. When Katherine walked down the aisle with her children beside her, she saw his eyes fill with tears, and her own answered in kind. The vows they spoke were traditional, but felt revolutionary to Katherine, who was promising herself to someone new while honoring what she had lost. When Isaac slipped the simple gold band on her finger, she felt Samuel's blessing like a warm breeze, as if he too approved of this man who would love and protect his family. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, with neighbors bringing food to share and music that got everyone dancing. Katherine watched Isaac dance with Margaret, the little girl's feet balanced on his boots as he waltzed her around, and felt her heart might burst with love. Later, he taught Daniel how to bow properly to a lady, and the boy asked one of the neighbor girls to dance with an earnestness that made all the adults smile. Thomas fell asleep on a bench, exhausted from excitement, his wooden horse tucked under his chin. That night, after they returned home and put the children to bed, Katherine and Isaac stood together on the porch and looked out at the land that was now theirs together. The drought had finally broken the week before, with 3 days of steady rain that had turned the prairie green again and filled everyone with renewed hope. The crops they had planted were responding beautifully, promising a harvest that would see them through the winter in comfort. "Thank you," Katherine said softly, leaning against Isaac's side. "For what?" he asked, wrapping his arm around her waist. "For stopping that day, for staying, for giving me and my children a life again." Isaac kissed the top of her head. "You gave me a life too, Katherine. Before I found you, I was just existing, moving from place to place with no purpose. You and the children gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. I should be thanking you." "Then we are both grateful," she said with a smile. "What a fine foundation for a marriage." They went inside together, and Katherine closed the door on her old life of struggle and worry. The future stretched ahead bright and full of possibility, and she was ready to embrace it with both hands. The years that followed were good ones, filled with the kind of happiness that comes from hard work and genuine love. The farm prospered under Isaac's management and Katherine's careful oversight. The crops came in strong each season, the livestock multiplied, and they were able to expand their holdings gradually until they had one of the most successful operations in the area. Isaac's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher spread, and people began coming to him for advice and assistance. But more important than the financial success was the family they built together. Isaac proved himself to be everything he had promised and more. He treated Daniel, Margaret, and Thomas as if they were his own blood, never showing favoritism or distance. He taught Daniel everything he knew about farming and ranching, shaping the boy into a capable young man who would eventually take over the operation. He indulged Margaret's love of learning, encouraging her to read every book they could acquire and supporting her dreams of becoming a teacher. He played with Thomas for hours, carving toys and telling stories, and making the youngest child feel secure and loved. Katherine flourished in ways she had never imagined possible. The woman who had stood on that sagging porch wondering how to feed her children became confident and strong, a partner to her husband in every sense. She and Isaac worked side by side during the days and fell into each other's arms at night, their love deepening with each passing season. The passion between them never faded, but rather grew richer, seasoned with friendship and respect, and the shared joy of watching their family thrive. 2 years after their marriage, Katherine gave birth to a son they named James, a healthy baby with Isaac's blue-green eyes and Katherine's determination. Isaac cried when he held his firstborn child, overcome with the miracle of new life after so much loss in his past. The older children doted on their baby brother, and Katherine watched her husband with their infant and felt complete in a way she had never thought possible again. 3 years after James came a daughter they named Elizabeth, a sweet-tempered baby who brought even more joy into their already full house. The farmhouse rang with the sounds of children laughing, fighting, playing, and growing, and Katherine often paused in her work to simply listen and give thanks for the abundance of her blessings. On a warm evening in June of 1880, 7 years after Isaac had first ridden up to their farm, Katherine stood on the porch and watched her family. The porch no longer sagged. The house had been expanded with an additional room, and the farm stretched out in all directions, showing signs of prosperity and careful tending. Isaac was teaching Daniel, now 15 and nearly as tall as his stepfather, how to break a new horse while giving advice and encouragement. Margaret, 12 years old and growing into a lovely young woman, sat under the oak tree reading to Thomas, who at 10 had discovered a love of adventure stories. James chased chickens with the intense focus of a 4-year-old on a mission, while baby Elizabeth napped in a cradle near Katherine's feet. Isaac looked up and caught Katherine watching them. He said something to Daniel, then walked over to the porch with that easy stride she had loved from the first day. His face had a few more lines now, weathered by sun and hard work, but his eyes still lit up when he looked at her the same way they had that first morning. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, climbing the steps and pulling her into his arms. Katherine leaned against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I am thinking about the day you rode up to this farm 7 years ago. I was standing right here, desperate and terrified and trying not to let my children see how close we were to losing everything. And now," Isaac prompted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now I have everything I could ever want," Katherine said simply. "You gave us a life, Isaac. You gave us security and love and a future. My children have everything they need because you made sure of it." Isaac tightened his arms around her. "Our children," he corrected gently. "All of them, not just the ones we made together. They are all mine, just as you are all mine." Katherine turned in his embrace and looked up at him, seeing the truth of his words written clearly on his face. "I love you," she said, the words as easy now as breathing after years of saying them daily. "I love you too," Isaac replied, then kissed her with a passion that still made her knees weak after all this time. A chorus of groans and giggles from their children interrupted the moment, and they broke apart laughing to find all 5 of them watching with various expressions of amusement and exaggerated disgust. Isaac chased them into the yard, scooping up Elizabeth from her cradle on the way and prompting squeals of delight from everyone. Katherine watched her husband play with their children and felt tears of happiness slip down her cheeks. That night, after the children were all tucked into their beds and the house was quiet, Katherine and Isaac lay together in their own room and talked about their dreams for the future. They spoke of Daniel going off to study agriculture in college, of Margaret opening a school for girls, of Thomas perhaps becoming a lawyer with his love of argument and words. They talked about watching James and Elizabeth grow and thrive, about grandbabies someday filling the house with new life. "Do you ever regret it?" Katherine asked in the darkness. "Stopping here that day instead of moving on?" Isaac pulled her closer and kissed her forehead. "Not for a single second. This is where I was always meant to be, Katherine, with you, with our children, building this life together. You and these children are all I need, and I will spend the rest of my days making sure you have all you need in return." Katherine smiled against his chest, thinking of how far they had come from that desperate morning when she had stood on the porch and stared at an empty flour barrel. She had been a widow with 3 starving children and no hope, but Isaac had seen past all that to the woman she could become with the right partner beside her. He had not just saved them, but had given them the tools and support to save themselves, to build a life rich in every way that mattered. "We did it together," she said softly. "You gave us the help we needed, but we all worked to build this life." "That is what family does," Isaac replied. "We take care of each other, support each other, love each other, and we will keep doing that for as long as we live." Katherine felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket as she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms. Outside, the Kansas prairie whispered its nighttime songs, the land they had tamed and nurtured with their love and sweat. The farm that had once been a source of desperation had become a home full of laughter and promise. The children who had gone hungry now went to bed with full bellies and fuller hearts. The woman who had been broken had been made whole again, not by forgetting her past, but by embracing her future. Her children were all she had needed in those dark days, the reason she kept fighting when everything else fell apart. But Isaac had made sure they had everything they needed to thrive, and in doing so, he had become as essential to her as breathing. Together they had created something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. As sleep claimed her, Katherine's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude for the cowboy who had ridden into her life and changed everything. She had loved Samuel with the passionate intensity of youth, and she would always honor his memory. But Isaac had taught her that the heart was capable of loving again after loss, that new beginnings were possible even in the midst of grief, and that sometimes strangers became family simply by choosing to care. The story could have ended in tragedy, with a desperate widow and her children losing their farm and being scattered to the winds. But instead, it became a tale of hope and redemption, of a man who chose to stop drifting and a woman who chose to open her heart again. It became the story of a family forged not just by blood, but by choice and commitment and unwavering love. The sun would rise tomorrow on the green Fletcher farm, as it had risen every day since Isaac arrived 7 years ago. The children would wake and eat breakfast together, teasing and laughing as siblings do. Katherine would work alongside her husband, their movements synchronized from years of partnership. The land would yield its bounty, the seasons would turn, and life would continue in all its messy, beautiful glory. And through it all, one truth would remain constant. Katherine's children had been all she had and all she needed in her darkest hour, but Isaac Fletcher had made sure they had everything they needed to flourish. In ensuring their well-being, he had found his own purpose and belonging. In accepting his help, Katherine had found love again when she thought that door was closed forever. It was a simple story in many ways, the tale of a family surviving and thriving on the Kansas prairie in the 1870s. But for Katherine and Isaac and their children, it was everything. It was home and hope, struggle and triumph, loss and love. It was the story of how a broken family was made whole again by the kindness of a stranger who became so much more. It was, quite simply, everything that mattered.